The next bit of fuel on the fire came only 4 years later with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, a law guided by then Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. In short, the law repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and did away with the previous agreement of no slavery north of the 3630 line. Instead, the people of a territory would decide for themselves whether to have or not have slavery. Well, the anti-slavery forces were outraged. Virtually all of the minority party Whigs and half of the Northern Democrats in Congress voted against the bill, the anti-slavery position. They concluded they should join forces and create a new party, the Republicans. As a side note, factions in Kansas sent more than one proposed constitution to Washington. All were rejected. Kansas finally came into the Union as a free state in 1861. Nebraska didn't come in until after the Civil War. John C. Fremont was the first Republican candidate for president in 1856. The Democrats put up James Buchanan. Former President Millard Fillmore was a third candidate on the Know-Nothing ticket, whose main issue was anti-immigration. In short, keep out everyone but white, male Protestants from England. Fremont, who was later territorial governor of Arizona, was anti-slavery. Buchanan and the Democrats endorsed the approach in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing states to vote slavery in or out. In the end, Democrat Buchanan received 45%. Republican Fremont had 33%, and Know-Nothing Fillmore got 22%. And this, the anti-slavery candidate Fremont was, of course, on the ballot in all the southern states. His total number of individual votes in all the southern states combined was 600. And this brings us back to the former congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. He had mostly practiced law since leaving Congress, but by 1856 was well known as a public speaker and an advocate for the new Republican Party. Lincoln was certainly opposed to slavery on moral grounds, but he had never been out front as a fire and brimstone abolitionist. He was against slavery spreading into the new territories and new states. He was against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but he desperately wanted to keep the Union together, if that was possible. During the following year, 1857, one very significant thing happened. It was a case before the U.S. Supreme Court called Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was an African-American slave who had been physically taken to a free state. There were laws that would indicate that this act constituted giving him his freedom. So Scott sued for that freedom. The Supreme Court was run by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, who had no sympathy for slaves. Taney's decision said that the slave, Dred Scott, had no right to even file a suit, and added that slaves were, quote, so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, end quote. Taney then overturned the Missouri Compromise, which banned slavery in territory north of the 3630 line, thus upholding the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He stated, quote, the act of Congress which prohibited a citizen from holding and owning enslaved persons in the territories of the United States north of that line therein is not warranted by the Constitution and is therefore void. It was a low point for the anti-slavery forces, and this event seemed absolutely their final straw. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln made known his desire to be chosen as the U.S. Senator from Illinois. His opponent would be incumbent Senator Stephen A. Douglas, the author of allowing the spread of slavery via that Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Illinois Republicans chose Lincoln as their nominee on June 16, and in accepting the honor, he gave what would be his first truly historic address, known as the House Divided Speech. Of course, the subject of his words, and indeed the entire campaign, was slavery, and that the nation had to go one way or the other. He said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall. but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. And he continued in part, either the opponents of slavery will stop the further spread of it, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Whether Abraham Lincoln realized it or did not realize it, this speech set the tone for the next 7 years of American history. No more kicking of the can of slavery down the road for future generations to deal with. After 80 years of futile compromises, the United States needed to settle the matter one way or the other. That election of 1858 is best known for a series of 7 joint appearances called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. One debate was held in each of the state's congressional districts. The substance of the exchanges was mostly slavery. It is reported that, in one way, these events brought American politics into the modern era. Shorthand, the method of rapidly writing down what was being said, had recently been developed. Newspapers had shorthand secretaries up front capturing the words. At the same time, the telegraph had gained nationwide reach. The result was that the actual speeches of Lincoln and Douglas reached the nation in short order. The one flaw to the system, newspapers supporting Lincoln or supporting Douglas tended to interpret the shorthand notes to benefit their own candidates. Douglas was already well known, but this new mass media experiment introduced Abraham Lincoln to the nation. One other thing of importance, in those days, U.S. senators were not elected by direct vote of the people. They were chosen by the state legislatures. So as Lincoln and Douglas campaigned, they were not asking for your vote. They were asking you to vote for the local state legislative candidate of their parties. At the end of the day, Douglas was the state Senate's choice by 14-11 and won the state House of Representatives by 40-35. And it is especially instructive to look at the Illinois map. Lincoln carried the North, Douglas carried the South, which seems a metaphor for what was to come. And perhaps to that point, with all the national publicity, by the end of the race, the South felt they knew Lincoln and assumed he was a person who wanted to end slavery once and for all, and they didn't like it. During the following months and year, Lincoln made more and more speaking appearances, likely somewhat with an eye on the 1860 Republican presidential nomination. There were powerful and well-known Republicans, governors, senators, and financiers who coveted the White House. But in the end, the nominating convention in the early summer of 1860, on the third ballot, chose Abraham Lincoln. This was not some holy anointment. There was plenty of backroom politics, but at its core, the party seemed to see Lincoln as the conscience of what they stood for. There were 4 candidates in the general election. John Breckinridge, senator from Kentucky, had been vice president under Buchanan. He was pro-slavery and was nominated by the Southern Democrats. John Bell, also from Kentucky, a former Speaker of the U.S. House, was a prosperous slave owner running on the short-lived Constitutional Union ticket. His platform was to not mention slavery much at all, but to just try to keep the Union together. Then there was Senator Stephen A. Douglas. For those who study political history, you'll understand when I say Douglas seemed like a 19th century version of Lyndon Johnson, a master of manipulating bills through the Congress. Witness the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He had never come out four square in favor of slavery, but he was always able to let slavery be expanded through his legislative maneuvers. This worked in Congress, but in the presidential election, the South saw him as neither fish nor fowl. His candidacy seemed to represent only some northern and western Democrats. In the end, he carried only 1.5 states, Missouri and half of New Jersey. Even John Bell beat him with 3. Breckinridge won 11, and all in the South. Abraham Lincoln prevailed with 17 states. He became the 16th President of the United States on March 4, 1861. His longtime adversary, Stephen A. Douglas, stood close by and held Lincoln's hat as he took the oath of office. Douglas died a few months later. Even though, as a candidate, he never actually called for the complete abolition of slavery, the South felt they knew Lincoln and what they were facing. Before he even took office, 7 states had declared their secession from the Union. They established a Southern government, the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as president. What's interesting is that the Confederate Constitution was almost identical to the U.S. Constitution, except for some key elements regarding slavery.